Hello, in this video, I will be going over the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. What was the war fought over? So there are two different theories as to why the war started. The first one was that it was fought to preserve the Union, and the second one was it was fought to end slavery. And I will talk about which one I think it was, but right now I will go over what happened that made the war start. Leading up to the war, there had been conflict between the northern and the southern states over slavery. The northern states wanted to abolish slavery, and the southern states wanted to keep slavery and expand it. The South began to be afraid that the North would eventually abolish slavery and that the federal government would try to control slavery in the slave state. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln became president. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and that party was against slavery. This made the Southerners angry because no one in the South had voted for Abraham Lincoln. The North had overpowered the South, and the South basically had no more political power. This led many of the southern states, 11 in total, to secede from the Union and form the Confederacy. One of the main principles of the Confederacy was that they wanted to preserve slavery. The Civil War started after the South had attacked and took over Fort Sumter. Abraham Lincoln had declared war on the Confederacy to prevent the states from seceding from the Union. Some of the advantages of the North or the Union were that they had a bigger population. There was 22 million people in the North, whereas there was 9 million people in the South. They had a better industry, they had more coal and iron, they had better resources, they had better manufacturing because they had more immigrants working in the factories. So they had more ammo, uniforms, weapons. They had a navy, and they also had an established government. Some of the advantages of the South was that they had established military tradition, so their soldiers would be better trained. They had very good officers like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. They had a better conviction, so they were fighting for survival, and they really wanted to fight, whereas some of the Northerners weren't willing to die in this war, and they were just willing to let the South go. And they didn't have to win. They just had to survive long enough so that the North would give up. And they also had they had to fight defensive battles, so they didn't have to travel. And also another thing was that DC was only across the river from them, so they had that tactical advantage. I will now go over some of the important battles of the war. The first important battle was the Battle of Bull Run. So this battle was important because it was connected to Ellen White, one of the founding pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and also sets the stage for the rest of the war. So prior to this battle, Ellen White had received a vision about it, and what she saw was that the North was charging against the South, and then an angel of God had interfered and caused confusion in the North. So the North started to retreat, and then the South started to push back onto the North. But the South also wasn't able to totally defeat the North because an angel also had caused confusion in them. And the reason God did this was to punish both the North and the South. He wanted the war to last longer than people thought it would. So he was punishing the North for allowing slavery to last for so long, and he was punishing the South for practicing the sin of slavery. God hates slavery. The second important battle of the war was the Battle of Antietam. So in the Battle of Antietam, the North pushed back the South, and this victory allowed Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This victory is important because it made the Emancipation Proclamation have more weight, so it seemed more serious, and it didn't seem like something that the North came up out of desperation. The Emancipation Proclamation was a military decree that basically said that all slaves in the South were free, and that if the rebelling states were to give up their slaves by a certain date, they could join the Union and they didn't have to fight. So Abraham Lincoln made this proclamation with the hope that some of the southern states would give up and they wouldn't have to fight them. The reason the Emancipation Proclamation was important was that it shifted the focus of the war from preserving the Union to ending slavery. Last important battle that I will talk about is the Battle of Gettysburg. This battle was important because this was a turning point of the war where the North started winning. So in this battle, the North had the high ground and the South just decided to keep on pushing. So the South ended up losing 1/3 of the people in their army, and this combined with a victory in the Battle of Vicksburg was what caused the Union to start winning. Now I will go back to the question in the beginning of the video. What was the war fought over? So as you can see, the war was initially fought over preserving the Union, but after the Emancipation Proclamation, it was shifted from preserving to the Union to freeing the slaves. And another question would be, was the Civil War a just war? So my answer to that would be, at first, yes and no, because if the war was only fought to just preserve the Union, I would say that that wouldn't be a just reason to start war. But if the main focus was to, which it eventually became the main focus, was to get rid of slavery, then I would say it was a just war. And in the end, the war ended up getting rid of slavery in America. So the answer to that question would be yes, the Civil War was a just war. Alright, so now I will be talking about the Reconstruction that happened after the Civil War. So there were 3 things that the government had to do in Reconstruction. The first thing was to figure out how they would bring back the southern states back into the Union, because they had just gone through a war and they had to bring them back into the Union. The second one was how they would rebuild the southern economy. So the first thing was that the southern economy had been totally based on cotton and slaves, but now that slavery was abolished, they would have to rebuild the economy. Also, many of the South lay in ruins as a result of the Civil War, so they would need to rebuild the South. The third thing they would need to do is promote the rights of the African Americans. This would be hard because until now, many people had looked down on African Americans and considered them as unequal. So they needed to promote the rights of the free. Okay, so the first thing I will talk about is what they did to promote African American rights. So what they did is they made the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. So the 13th Amendment, it basically made it so that slavery was illegal. So slavery was abolished from America. The 14th Amendment made it so that all men, regardless of race, were all equally protected under the law. So this included African Americans. And the 15th Amendment gave all people the right to vote. And once again, this included African Americans. Now I will talk about the Military Construction Act of 1867. So this is how the federal government brought back the states into the Union. So they separated the southern states into 10 military districts, and they set former Union generals in charge of those 5 military districts. And in order for the states to be re-admitted into the Union, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which, to remind you, it was the amendment that gave all men equal protection under the law. And they also had to guarantee the right for black men to vote in their state constitution. So earlier I mentioned that Rebuilding the southern economy was one of the goals for Reconstruction, but actually, improvement of the economy happened for both the North and the South. So for the South, the recovery from the Civil War took longer because the war was on southern land. So most of the factories and farms and cities were destroyed. So they ended up staying as an agrarian or a farming society for much longer. However, they expanded their economy from just depending on cotton. They now planted a wider variety of crops, and they also started making industrial products. I will now talk about how the Civil War had an impact on the northern and industry and the industry of USA on a whole. So in the North during the Civil War, they used their factories to manufacture ammunition, medical supplies, uniforms, weapons, and this is how they had the upper hand. They also built a lot of railroads, and after the Civil War, they just continued this. They continued expanding their factories and expanding their railroads. Because of the sweeping industrialization in the cities and in the factories, the North was able to emerge to a world power. They were able to do this because they mass-produced goods, and they also had a lot of resources. So they sent their resources, they sent their goods off to foreign lands, and through that they were able to make money. And this made the US become an economical world power. So I will talk about why the Reconstruction ended. So many of the northern banks were starting to fail. This is because they were not being paid back for the funds that they gave for the expanding railroads. And there was economic depression, so many jobs were being lost, and the people in the North were more concerned about the economy, their jobs, and corruption rather than being concerned about Reconstruction. The event that marked the end of Reconstruction was the Compromise of 1876. So on the election of 1876, there wasn't a clear winner between the Democrat and the Republican candidate. So they decided that the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, would win. In exchange for that, the Democrats would have control over the South. The federal troops in the South would be pulled out, and money would be given so the ports and the railroads would be fixed. And this compromise is what ended Reconstruction. So let's look at what was accomplished during the Reconstruction. So some things that were accomplished was that there was a tax system that supported a school system, and it did raise African American expectations for their rights. However, it did postpone that guarantee until the civil rights movement, which would happen many. So now I'll go back to the industrialization of America. So as I said before, the factories and railroads were expanded. Soon they developed mass production in factories, which was a faster and cheaper way to produce many products. And they also expanded railroads, so those products would be easily shipped to the consumers. They would export these products and get profit. During these times, there was what was called the LAISSEZ-FAIRE policies, and this made it so that there was minimal interference from the government and that the big businesses were able to get bigger. So there was more expansion of the businesses, and there was more investment of those big businesses, also known as corporations, would do what they can to get the most profit that they could. So they would do this by paying their workers as little as possible. They would do advertisements so that there would be more people buying their products, and they would also work with other corporations so that they could control the prices. This was known as a cartel. And many people started to dislike the big businesses because they took advantage over small businesses. the gap between the rich and the poor was growing immensely, and they saw them as being corrupt. This led to the government starting to take more control of the businesses. They made laws that limited the power of the businesses. So one of these laws was the Interstate Commerce Commission. What this did, it made it so that the railroad wouldn't charge too much for the people who would use the trains. And another one of these laws was known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. So this prevented the corporations from forming cartels and controlling the prices. Another thing that arose during this time to control the big businesses was labor. So unions were a group of people that wanted to voice their concerns for the workers of the corporations. So they would do things like strikes or collective bargaining, and they would basically negotiate for better working conditions or higher wages or better hours. They were doing this because some of the working conditions in the factory were pretty bad. Like, it was pretty dark, it was dangerous, it was dirty, and sometimes the workers weren't even getting paid that much. So this was a way that they were looking to improve that. Now I'll be talking about the workforce of those factories and those jobs in the north. So these included Southerners who migrated to the north and immigrants who moved to America. At this time, farm work was being mechanized. Because of this, there was less jobs available in the farm, and the farmers in the south began to move to the cities in the north. They moved to the north because there were more jobs offered, there was education in the cities, and there was other conveniences in the cities. Things like stores and other stuff like that. This great move from the farm to the cities was called urbanization. Now I will talk about the immigrants. During this time, after the Civil War, most of the immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe as well as Asia. Before this, most of the immigrants were German and Irish Catholics, and before that, they were Protestants from Western and Northern Europe. Immigrants came to America to seek better life. So in their homeland, there was a lot of famine, a lot of this bad economy, political unrest. This was what was happening in Asia, and for others, they were experiencing religious discrimination, like the Jews that were coming from Europe. So they came to America because they were promised religious liberty and also because of the many jobs that were offered. So most of the immigrants moved to the cities. Because of the fierce competition and because many of the group of immigrants had already experienced poverty, they were willing to work for low pay. But like they were in the past and like they are even now, the immigrants were mistreated and discriminated. They were people who were called nativists, and they believed that American white-born citizens were superior to those immigrants. So they discriminated those immigrants, and they were sort of mad because of the competition, the job competition that the immigrants created. There's also the Chinese Exclusion Act that lasted from 1882 to 1943, where Chinese laborers weren't allowed to move into America. And even after it was repealed, some of the officials still continued to enforce. So many of the immigrants who moved to America created and lived in their own ethnic neighborhoods. So these were neighborhoods where the people spoke the same language, had the same ethnicity, or shared the same religion. And we have these neighborhoods still in Los Angeles today. Some examples of those are Little Tokyo, Koreatown, and Chinatown. Immigrants adapted to the American culture, but they also added to it. One way they did this was through food. So we have many foods in America that came from immigrants. Some examples of these are pizza, Korean barbecue, and ramen. Now I will talk about the improvements and culture in cities. One of the important inventions that was made during this time was electricity and the light bulb. This helped facilitate the industrialization of the cities because it shifted the society from being a 12-hour day to a 24-hour day, since rooms and the places where they lived in were able to stay lit up during the nighttime. Other innovations that helped improve city life were skyscrapers, safe elevators, central heating, and public transit systems. This included streetcars, and this helped in transportation from work or wherever the people needed to go. I will now talk about certain problems that were in the cities. So many people in the cities lived in these places called tenements, and these were housings that were very tight and they squeezed many people into it, and they were very unsanitary. They were full of trash and sometimes horse corpses, and these unsanitary living spaces caused many epidemics. So city planners sought to improve this by improving sewage and plumbing, and also using clean water that were taken from reservoirs. Another problem that arose was mass fires, and the way people fixed this was using fireproof building materials. So instead of using wood, they would use bricks and metal, and they also started having full-time professional firefighters. Now I will talk about the culture of the. So unlike many of the farm workers, the city workers were paid cash wages, and they used these to buy their food. However, most of the workers had extra cash, and because of this, this resulted in the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age was a term to describe the city life. So it's, from the outside, it looked very prosperous, it looked very good, it looked very tempting, but in reality, it wasn't as good as it seemed to. Another thing that these wages brought about was something called Conspicuous Consumerism. So this is where people wanted and bought everything that came out. So before, in the farm life, you weren't really able to afford much because you didn't have any wages. But now, they were able to afford a lot of products in the market. An example of this would be how many of the kids now want to get the new game, and their parents are often able to afford the new game. Another social trend that came around this time was something called mass culture. So in mass culture, Americans, despite their social classes, they generally bought the same type of things and the same style of things. So an example of this would be how in Chinatown you could usually get a cheap t-shirt, and then you could also get a t-shirt that looks similar to that t-shirt in like a designer store. They would look the same, but the quality would be different. The reason this happened was because there were many things in this time that brought the nation together. This included the transportations, the communications, and especially advertising. So during this time, newspapers had many ads for different products, and these ads are what helped bring about mass. One reasons the newspapers were so effective during this time is because the education system was getting better. So as a result of the education system getting better, more Americans were able to read the newspapers. So around this time, the amount of public high schools was increasing up to the point where there was eventually 5,000 public high schools in America. And these high schools taught the students necessary skills to improve the industry. So this included science, woodworking, and also business. These schools also helped Americanize the immigrants who were coming into America. So they taught them about American culture and how to be good citizens in America. As I mentioned before, there are many innovations during this time, and a lot of those innovations helped give the citizens more free time on their hands. So one example of this are the transportation systems, the cars, the street carts. These made it so people didn't have to spend so much time commuting. Another one of these innovations was the washing machine. So before, people would usually spend a lot of their day washing their clothes, but now with the washing machine, they didn't have to spend that much time out of their day to wash their clothes. So they filled up this free time with entertainment. One of the entertainments that a lot of people went to was roller coasters. Another ones are shows. So there was this sort of moving circus called Buffalo Bill, and people watched that. And there was also vaudeville shows, which is kind of like Saturday Night Live, but you only watch it in person. And another one of these was baseball. So more people began to play baseball, more people began to watch baseball, and this is what helped baseball become one of the great sports that we play in America now. I hope you enjoy your Christmas break.